Okay, good morning. I'm Kevin Barnes-Ceeney. I'm a professor at the University of New Haven in Connecticut, and I'm presenting with Professor Lior Gideon, who's a professor from John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. So today we're going to be talking about our research study of perpetrators of genocide in Rwanda. Here, what we're interested in is the forgiveness-seeking behaviors of incarcerated genocide perpetrators. So how likely they are and what influences there are for people to actually want to seek forgiveness after committing crimes. So it's looking at the perpetrator's point of view. But firstly, one sec. Just a little background on the Rwandan genocide. Rwandan genocide, we're looking at between 800,000 and 1 million people killed in approximately 100 days. So this is extremely fast genocide. We're talking 7,000 people dying each day. The country littered with corpses after just 100 days. A country pretty much destroyed, no money. The banks are all just rubble. All the money's looted and stolen. No clean water because the reservoirs are filled with corpses. It's a genocide against the Tutsi and the moderate Hutu within the country. The Hutu were the majority. Of course, these are ethnic and racial categories that were just exaggerated by the Belgian colonists. Tutsis being those relatively more elite than the Hutu. The Tutsis were the cattle owners. The Hutu were general farmers. So when the genocide kicked off on April 7th, 1994, when the president's plane had been shot down, we'd never got to the bottom of who actually shot down the plane, whether it was Hutu extremists themselves or the Tutsis. The genocide unfolded. And it was a genocide which is known as the intimate genocide. And it's the intimate genocide because a lot of the killing was one-on-one killing. It's killing by organized Hutu groups armed with machetes, nail-studded clubs, and guns, hunting and killing Tutsis and moderate Hutus as they hid in their houses, as they hid in the marshes, hid in churches, hid in the forests. It's also called the most efficient genocide, owing to the speed and scale of it. Atrocities included impaling male victims from anus to throat. Female breast ablation was common. Using HIV as a weapon through rape. And just one example would be Nyamata Church. You had 12,000 Tutsis hiding in the church. The genocidal groups came through, sealed off the church through Molotov cocktails through the windows and burned everyone inside. As people tried to leave, they then macheted them on the way out. So horrendous atrocities. This photo always really sticks with me. This is right by the Congolese border as many genocide perpetrators fled into the Congo, leaving their machetes at the border. You can just see the sheer scale of it. So after the genocide, after these 100 days, the country in disarray, trying to start this process of what they called unity and reconciliation in the hope of never having such a genocide again. Of course, forgiveness is an important component of reconciliation, although we learned in the keynote speaker that, of course, forgiveness and reconciliation are two very different terms. If we want to reconcile, forgiveness is an important piece of it, but forgiveness might not be so easy. So here's a genocide survivor talking in the relatively early days after genocide. I don't understand this word reconciliation. I can't reconcile with people, even if they're in prison. If a person has come to ask my forgiveness, I'll pardon him after he's resuscitated the members of my family that he killed. But we see some hope in this kind of forgiveness process. Others saying, why should we refuse to forgive them? Anyway, our people will not be brought back. So for some it's easy, they don't understand, and for others forgiving is an important part of the reconciliation process. And I don't need to spend long on this because I think this has been covered well this morning already. We recognize that forgiveness, scholars recognize as a universal value, although it's often pushed to the side and not given the importance that it has. And every major world religion has forgiveness as a central component. You've got ideas of Yom Kippur and atonement and thinking back over the last year. You've got images in Christianity of Christ on the cross, us calling out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And it's in the Islamic faith, key component is will they not turn to Allah in repentance and seek his forgiveness? Because remember, Allah is all forgiving and most merciful. Of course, reconciliation and trying to bring a country back together again is a process, and it's a long and a difficult process. And forgiveness is a part of this reconciliation process. And we learned from the keynote speech that reconciliation is this process that slowly occurs, so it reduce and then eventually ameliorate any feelings of resentment between the two opposing groups. It's a process of healing traumas of both the victims and the perpetrators after violence, providing closure of the bad relations. And notice here, this idea of reconciliation is including the perpetrators as well as survivors and victims of atrocities. And Staub recognizes this, the end point of full reconciliation. And this is where the forgiveness piece comes in. It involves some degree or form of forgiving, of letting go of the past, letting go of that anger, and the desire for revenge. We need to recognize that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. As forgiveness, it doesn't require mutuality. Very often forgiveness occurs in the absence of the perpetrator taking any responsibility, no apology, or seeking atonement. And Desmond Tutu reminds us of this, and he says that if the victim could forgive only when the culprit confessed, then the victim would be locked into the culprit's whim, locked into victimhood, whatever her own attitude or intention, that would be palpably unjust. So there's a certain freedom in forgiveness. In Rwanda, they went down a path of institutionalized forgiveness, which is really the government saying we must forgive. Genocide, or people who engaged in the genocide, they divided into categories, level 1 categories, the people who were the leaders and the planners, or engaged in extreme torture. Level 2, the killers within the genocide. Then you had 3 and 4 people involved in looting, and so on. And Paul Kagame was saying, the president of Rwanda, that the forgiveness piece, we don't need to forgive the planners, but we should forgive level 2, level 3, and level 4 people. So there was a kind of institutionalized forgiveness in Rwanda as a kind of government policy. So President Kagame was the one who led the Rwandan Patriotic Front into Rwanda to push out the genocide perpetrators, has been the president of Rwanda ever since. And pushing this notion of apology and forgiveness going hand in hand. He's saying that if a genocide perpetrator has asked for an apology, then we should and we must forgive them. He very much tied apology and forgiveness together. And we see this most in the Gacaca courts. They started prosecuting people for genocide through the 1990s. They realized that it would take approximately 200 years to process everybody through the conventional court system. So they set up the system of Gacaca, or justice in the grass. So this is communities were mandated to attend these courts held in open fields where genocide perpetrators, the crimes would be laid against them. They had the opportunity to apologize, and if you apologize, you received a lighter sentence. There's still justice. You still get sentenced. If you killed, you go to prison, and so on. But Gacaca courts were a piece of this forgiveness process. Just wanted to have an acknowledgement of this term radical forgiveness, which has emerged in the literature, which when I was listening to Professor Enright, the forgiveness he was talking about seemed to be what scholars are calling radical forgiveness. This thing that forgiveness, you don't need the apology in order for forgiveness to occur. And of course, radical forgiveness in its purest form has been heavily criticized in the literature. It suggests that primary victims are the only ones who can actually forgive the perpetrator. A secondary victim, a family member, can perhaps only forgive the harm that has been caused to them, but they can't forgive for the actual initial crime itself. And feminists argue that if we're pushing radical forgiveness, then what we're doing is we're avoiding, it's unsatisfactory because it's maintaining the oppressive status quo of society by simply forgiving people. And this may be about misinterpreting or misunderstanding forgiveness. What Rwanda was doing, or the government was pushing, was not radical forgiveness, but forgiveness that's very much tied in with notions of apology too. So what few studies have done, however, is consider the role of the perpetrator and their forgiveness-seeking behaviors. So specifically what we did was we went to 3 prisons in Rwanda. We went to Gasabo prison in Kigali, which is known as where the intellectuals were being housed who had committed a crime of genocide. Went to Mahanga prison, which is a mixed prison, kind of in the center of the country. And we also went to Goma prison, which is a female-only prison. So why did we go to these prisons? Because these were the ones that we were given access to, and these were the ones that the government said had the most genocide perpetrators incarcerated in them. Gasabo prison has since burned down. There seems to be a spate over the last few years of prisons housing genocide perpetrators mysteriously catching fire and burning, suggesting that forgiveness at that national level isn't kind of being carried out at local levels. It's a big concern, this burning of prisons in Rwanda. What we did was we oversampled women because often in criminology and criminal justice research, we ignore female perpetrators. So we made an effort to actually go to women's prisons and speak to females incarcerated for genocide. So these are all perpetrators who had killed during the genocide. And Lior is going to now talk about the research methods and some of our findings.
I'm going to present the quantitative part of the research, and then Kevin is going to close with some remarks on the qualitative aspect, because we basically did there 2 parts of the study. We collected data, we analyzed it, but then we wanted to gain some insight on what's going on and what we found. So as Kevin said, we had about 180 males and 122 females that were perpetrators of the genocide. They were all classified as Category 1 and Category 2. These are people that actually took part in the genocide, either planning or executing things. And the analysis that I'm going to show you is over the 302 people that we basically examined in the quantitative aspect, and then Kevin is going to basically summarize with the in-depth interviews. Overall, the data collection was guided by an IRB, which is Institutional Review Board, to maintain ethics. They got consent forms. Kevin and Laurie, who is also on this presentation, went to those prisons. They basically worked with interpreters that work with them. A lot of people basically argued for, they had issues with reading, with literacy, or with eyesight. We believe that a lot of them kind of like kept their thing on the safe side. They didn't really want to write anything down or do it on their own, because when they go to trial, they say, oh, he wrote it, I never said it, it's something else. But that was part of it. Usually the interviews and all the battery of tests that we gave them took between 30 to 40 minutes to complete. We collected data in the quantitative analysis on standard demographics, of course, attitudes toward reconciliation and forgiveness that were adopted from STAB. I'm going to show you in particular the items that are measuring forgiveness and not reconciliation, and this is basically what we ran, because we also did another study that we published on reconciliation. But we also measured physical health that we mentioned earlier today here, anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then Kevin is going to talk about support and programming in prison, hopes and fears, and apology through the qualitative part. So we use the Kellner Symptom Questionnaire. It's a 92 item that examines somatic symptom subscale, anxiety subscale, and depression subscale. They all came highly reliable in this study, which means that they are measuring and they are consistent with what we are trying to measure. And we also measured the civilian post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, which is a 17 item that correspond with the DSM-4, and that one was also found to be reliable in our study. Just to show you, there were two waves of sentencing. The first one was regular courts, and you see that it significantly ended up with much longer sentences. In the second wave of sentencing, that was what Kevin described, the gachacha. It had a component of forgiveness in it, and people basically were sentenced to shorter, significantly shorter duration of time in that wave. So when we're looking at depression, we are finding that overall the sample had rise level of depression compared with the general population. With a mean score of 7.55 was observed. And when you're looking at the numbers, you're saying it's 7.55 out of 23. Don't judge it by that. Judge it compared to the general population. People don't score usually that high in the general population. 40% reported 8 or more depressive symptoms, and 10% reported 12 or more depressive symptoms, which are basically the indication for clinical depression or major depression. Males had higher levels of depression compared with females, and that was found to be significant, statistically significant. When we look at anxiety, overall the sample had low levels of anxiety, and 32.2% had 8 or more symptoms of anxiety, which is abnormally high when you're looking at civilians. Again, male had an overall higher anxiety level compared to females. When we look at somatic symptoms, these are pains in the body, these are difficulties breathing, all kinds of physical ailment that people report. 46% report poor appetite, 37% weak limbs, meaning they can't really do a lot, they can't function. And the last two items that we have here, 41% trouble falling asleep and 49% trouble breathing, were also found to be highly correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is something important that we're going to show you in the regression later. So then we checked the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and overall our sample has elevated levels of post-traumatic stress scores, about 42.5 out of 85, where the cutoff point is 30. So in civilian PTSD measures, that is considered extremely high for them. 2/3 of the sample had scores above the civilian cutoff levels, which is 30, and just under a quarter had a score above military cutoff level, which is 50. For military, it's 50 and above, and we had more than 25, slightly more than 25% that really reported PTSD for military cutoff. Male, again, had significantly higher PTSD level compared to females because they were more engaged in the actual genocide. So we're moving into the measurement of forgiveness. We actually had our dependent variable, what we were trying to predict, forgiveness, and we tried to do that through 4 items that you see in that graph. And basically, we asked, we created a scale using these 4 items. I asked to be forgiven for my actions against the victim. I asked to be forgiven for my action against the other group. I asked to be forgiven for not acting in a helpful way, and I should ask for forgiveness and make reparations to others. And what we are seeing overall, that the overall sample of perpetrators, they are really seeking that forgiveness. They really want to have that forgiveness in their life. They want to try and move on with their lives. So the first thing that we did, we ran a general linear model that examined forgiveness, and what we found was that People in Muhanga prison had higher, if you were in Muhanga prison, you actually were more, asking more of a forgiveness, because we think this is because it's a mixed prison and the people that sat in that prison were sentenced for much longer durations of time. So in a way, the interaction between having a mixed prison and it was also more crowded, but longer sentences really brought them to really seek more forgiveness compared to Gazabo. Nagoma is a female prison, and they also were much higher than just Gazabo, which was a male prison. Then we are looking, and this is something that is consistent to many other studies, post-traumatic stress disorder was found to have a significant effect on people's willingness to seek and forgiveness. And we see that the higher your post-traumatic stress score is, the more likely you are to seek forgiveness and ask for it. Then what we did is we really wanted to compare the different items according to gender, and again we found significant difference leaning toward female usually were significantly more likely to ask for forgiveness compared to males and compared to the overall sample, which led us then to basically create two regression models, one for males and one for females. And there is something here maybe to lighten up the mood, the way I see it. What we found in somatization that it did not have any effect on females, but it did on males. And I always say the joke, when males are sick or don't feel well, they behave like babies. They want everybody to take care of them, everybody to forgive them. So we actually see it here. We see that males that had high scores on somatic symptoms that suffered from illnesses really were like, I really want to be forgiven. I want to be over and done with it. Please, release me from these pains, release me from everything. Please forgive me. And again, we see that post-traumatic stress is highly correlated and has an effect on the will to seek forgiveness. And this really adds to previous studies. So Kevin is now going to basically close everything with the quantitative.
And I can be quick here for the interest of time. So qualitative 75 interviews. What emerged from there was, we're asking about how worried are you about coming out, particularly when you're returning back to the same community in which you killed neighbors within your own neighborhood. And people were generally saying that they were looking forward to coming out and they weren't worried because they had asked for forgiveness. They had asked for forgiveness during Gacaca. They had written letters of apology to the victim's family. That was an important piece. I'm going to be okay because I've asked the victim's family to forgive me. Majority of people acknowledging that we have a need to live in peace and unity, so we need to do this institutionalized forgiveness process. Some talked about receiving visits from the victim's family, had come and seen them in prison. Or they had heard from neighbors that it's okay, the victim's family have forgiven me, so when I come out, it's going to be okay. And finally, let me try and move, there we go. People talked about forgiving people who didn't visit them in prison, that they've been stuck in prison for 15 years, no one came in, but I forgive them too. Emerged from the qualitative findings. So finally, pulling this together, what have we learned in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and forgiveness? That forgiveness, it plays certainly a central role as incarcerated genocide perpetrators are preparing for release, that a government-sanctioned forgiveness kind of paved the way from them. Obviously, people with higher levels of post-traumatic stress are much more likely to seek forgiveness than those with lower levels of post-traumatic stress. That we know from the literature that forgiveness can be an important piece of the PTSD recovery process, both for survivors and the perpetrators too. We learned from a keynote speaker that forgiveness may help reduce negative emotions, anger, resentment, bitterness, and so on for survivors and for perpetrators. And finally, and I think this has been a kind of drumbeat of the morning, that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's not about condoning the traumatic event, anything about it. It's all about letting go of negative feelings associated with the experience and finding ways to move forward, which Rwanda as a country is trying to do. So thank you so much.